following subject matter is real and only intended for mature audiences. Discretion is advised.
People are dead after deputies say a man went on a shooting rampage.
I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her.
I can tell you the scene out there is absolutely horrific.
Nobody knows where this individual may strike next.
This is 10-Minute Murder.
Hi, welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thanks for joining today. Spooky season continues with a special episode today. I'll explain why it's special in just a moment. But first, let me recognize those of you that are new to 10-Minute Murder. In the last few weeks, the show has grown quite a bit quicker than normal, and I attribute that to the regular listeners sharing this podcast with their friends, family, coworkers, strangers on the street. I don't know. I appreciate those of you that are telling people about it. If you're new and it's your first time listening, I hope you'll stick around, subscribe, and connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. All the links for that are in the show notes of this episode. Now, the reason today's episode is special. Earlier this year, a person named Jamie reached out to me, sent me a message, and asked about doing an episode on BTK, Dennis Rader. This was much earlier in the year, and BTK is a story it's hard to tackle in this kind of a show because there's just so much to talk about. And I try to keep everything to 10 minutes or so. And there's just so many details to it. I didn't think I'd be able to do it, but I told her that I would try. Well, fast forward to this summer, and Jamie's sister Leah reached out and told me that she and her sister both liked listening to the podcast and would often get together and talk about the episodes. And on August 25th, Jamie lost her battle with COVID and passed away at the age of 43 years old. She left behind twin daughters who have both also reached out to me after I posted about Jamie a couple months ago on Facebook. And her family acknowledged that maybe it's a little weird to dedicate an episode of a murder podcast to her memory. But personally, I think all of us true crime enthusiasts are a little different-minded to begin with. And to the family of Jamie, I don't know you personally, but I love you and you're in our prayers. Now to the story. When something terrible happens, something that is so evil, it transcends the limits of human understanding, we begin to look for an explanation. For example, when a mass murderer takes 50 innocent lives in a ruthless killing spree, we look at that person and think, what caused them to commit such a gruesome act? Was there a mental illness behind everything? Or maybe in their past something happened so terrible it turned them into a killer? Or were they just simply born evil? Many serial killers have been able to successfully hide out in plain sight for even extremely long periods of time. Those who successfully blend in are typically employed, have families and homes, and outwardly appear non-threatening, like average members of society. They look just like everyone else. So what drives them to take human life? This time, we take a look at Dennis Rader, or as he's known, BTK. We'll look into his life, his past, and see if there were any warning signs of the future serial killer he would turn out to be, or see if his childhood and life before his crimes were just as ordinary as anybody else's. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in a quiet corner of Kansas, blissfully unaware of the chaos of World War II that was coming to its end just 6 months later. Dennis was the oldest among the four sons of a bookkeeper, Dorothea May Rader, and Kansas Gas and Electricity employee William Elvin Rader. His brothers were named Paul, Bill, and Jeff. According to Dennis, his mother fell off a horse when she was pregnant with him and also dropped him on his head when he was just 6 or 8 months old. Quote, I turned blue, but not taken to the hospital. The right side of my head hit hard. I may have scrambled the network. Dennis might have been right. A head injury at an early age is one of the most stereotypical red flags mentioned when discussing the development of a serial killer, so not a very promising start for little Dennis. While there are otherwise not many bad things to say about the Rader family life, both parents did work long hours and paid little attention to the children at home. Dennis's mother also suffered from postpartum depression after her fourth son, in part because she hoped for a girl. She often chose to spend most of her time with a friend, the TV, or a book instead of spending time with her children. As a result, Dennis felt ignored, especially by his mother, causing him to resent her. While family issues are a recurring theme in the histories of serial killers, luckily most people that didn't grow up with a balanced childhood still have healthy coping mechanisms. In Dennis's case, not so much. Though born in Pittsburgh, Dennis Rader grew up in Wichita, where the family had settled into a modest but pleasant home at 4815 North Seneca. That house would stay Rader family-owned until it was sold in 2005. Dennis attended Riverview School and later graduated from Wichita Heights High School. Dennis himself recalls he had major issues at school, saying, quote, "I was slow and had problems with big words. Still, today, I have to use a dictionary a lot for spelling. To me, playtime or fantasy time was more important than homework." And I don't know that that's too out of the ordinary for most high school boys. But those who knew Dennis described him as quiet and polite and preferred to keep to himself. When his peers attended parties and other social events, Dennis had little to no interest in joining them. In addition, he didn't enjoy music and seemed to lack a sense of humor. Still, he was one of those people that chose his words very carefully before he spoke. Even back then, Dennis himself knew he was not quite right, saying that he had problems. Of the problems, he said, quote, sexual fantasies, probably more than normal. All males probably go through some kind of sexual fantasy. Mine was just probably a bit weirder than other people. And there's a long-standing and established rule on 10-Minute Murder that we don't kink shame here. There's no shame in having non-common fantasies, but there is always a limit. Dennis claimed that it all started when he was a young boy and saw his mother, who got her ring caught on a couch spring and she couldn't get her hand out, so she asked little Dennis to get help. That moment, he felt the first stirrings of arousal, seeing a trapped, helpless woman, and he said, quote, "I was scared yet excited. I stared at her. I had a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach and the groin area." That moment became imprinted in his mind, and that feeling Dennis always longed for later in life. And so Dennis began to practice. He would often tie a rope around his ankles and hands and place a bag on his head, an eerily similar method that Dennis would later use for his unwilling participants. He acted out sexual fetishes for voyeurism, autoerotic asphyxiation, and cross-dressing, often spying on female neighbors while dressed in women's clothing, including women's underwear he had stolen. Dennis also cut out photographs of beautiful women from magazines and drew ropes and gags on them to satisfy his fantasies of torturing trapped and helpless women. However, the pictures quickly proved ineffective to keep Dennis under control. But Dennis did not have violent thoughts only towards women. We all know the one sign that is said to predict if there is a high probability for someone to grow up to become a serial killer or violent individual, and Dennis was a model example. He was cruel and abusive to animals, even hanging cats and dogs after first torturing them. Still, Dennis kept this side of his life well hidden from everybody that knew him, so nobody had a chance to intervene. Dennis eventually graduated from Wichita Heights High School in 1963 and spent the next 2 years working odd jobs before enrolling at Kansas Wesleyan College in Salina. However, Dennis only studied there for 2 semesters before dropping out and joining the Air Force in 1966 at age 21. He was first sent to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas for basic training before spending time in 2 more bases in the U.S. until he was moved to Okinawa in 1968. During his time with the Air Force, Dennis also had assignments in Greece, Korea, and Turkey, and eventually reached the rank of sergeant. Otherwise, nothing remarkable happened during those 4 years, and it seemed like Dennis did not let his fellow airmen see his dark side. He was just one of the guys, blended in so well that his former buddies were shocked as they found out decades later what Dennis had done. He was eventually discharged from active duty in the summer of 1970, and Dennis returned to his hometown of Wichita, Kansas. There, Dennis continued to maintain an ordinary outward appearance. He took up work as an electrician and met his future wife, 23-year-old bookkeeper Paula Dietz. And where did they meet? Through the church, of course. Dennis was a member of the Christ Lutheran Church and had been elected president of the church council. He was also a Cub Scout leader. What better way to blend into the community? Dennis moved pretty quick and proposed after just a few dates, and he and Paula married on May 22, 1971, and moved to Park City, where they eventually had 2 children, Carrie and Brian. And with a person like Dennis, it makes you wonder if he really wanted a family in the first place. Did Dennis wish to live everyday life, or was this just all one big act intended to hide his true self? In 1972, Dennis began working as an assembler for the Coleman Company, a camping supplies manufacturer and Wichita's largest employer at the time. The employment lasted for 13 months until July 1973. Around that time, Dennis began his studies at Wichita State University. It would have taken him 6 years of night school to earn his degree. For Dennis, 6 years was a long, long time. You see, Dennis was still, like I mentioned before, a poor student. And it's believed he might have had some type of learning disability in addition to being a horrible speller. He never achieved more than a C average, and understandably, Dennis was feeling frustrated. On top of that, in late 1973 or early 1974, Dennis was fired from his job. He had been working briefly for Cessna, the aircraft manufacturer, but now he was once again unemployed and unhappy. Any average person in this situation would just sit down, try to relax, weigh their options, and eventually find a solution, a new job, or a healthy hobby to use their extra time with. But not Dennis. No. Dennis had other plans. Dennis later stated that at this point in his life, while his wife was working at a VA hospital, he began trolling, meaning he would walk around neighborhoods or school campuses and simply observe. He observed mostly women, revisiting his childhood fantasies about bondage, torture, and death, imagining in detail what he would do to his victims. And so, in Dennis's head, a mantra formed: bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK was about to be born. That's today's 10-minute murder, brief and bingeable true crime. And I'm realizing just now that I didn't tell you at the beginning that this was going to be a multiple-part episode. Surprise! We'll pick up with part 2, where Dennis Rader becomes BTK on the afternoon of January 15th, 1974, when he killed members of the Otero family. And that episode will take us from then right up until today. Thanks for listening today, and if you are brand new to this podcast, I hope you will subscribe and then follow 10-Minute Murder on social media. The links are in the show notes of this episode, or you can just type 10-Minute Murder into the search bar wherever you want to follow 10-Minute Murder, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And if you're really into the podcast and happen to listen on Apple, you can leave a 5-star review, and that helps the show grow and reach more and more people. Thank you for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Have a good night.